And in the lecture that he gave, I don't remember most of the lecture, but the one line he spoke, which was really interesting, he said, "This is a movement for the living entity." And I was thinking how, generally we talk about saving the human beings, but he was, describing the movement as a movement for all living entities. So that really struck me.
Somehow or other, and I'm never quite sure how it happened, he and I ended up alone in the room. And it was Srila Prabhupada's room. He always had a coffee table, which he used as a desk, because he liked to sit on the floor. And he had an armoire next to it, a steel cabinet, such as he used to have in India. And in it, he used to keep his correspondence and books and things like that. And Srila Prabhupada was behind the desk, and he was showing me, incidentally to doing something else, how he would open up an envelope with a letter opener and then use the envelope for his reply, and then to save paper and for his first draft. And then he'd draft it out again onto the letter when he had it down the way he wanted it. And somehow he had asked me to do something, and in the end, I ended up behind his desk, and he ended up on the other side. I was so on my toes and alarmed by the experience of being alone with Prabhupada. It was just like being with Queen Elizabeth or Indra or something of that sort, all alone. And you say, "Oh my God, what am I going to do now? I have no instruction. I don't even know what to say," because I wasn't just initiated. And I had, been a part of the Hridayashri. I was still sort of psychedelicizing a little bit. And Srila Prabhupada was standing there, and I'm sitting there totally mortified, wringing my hands and squirming my toes and wondering what to do next, and not wanting to leave by any means, but not knowing what to do if I stayed. And Srila Prabhupada looked at me and said, "We should always be considering what is my duty," he said. And I'm thinking, duty, okay. And I was been hearing impaired since I was young, and I didn't know that. And it's only the last few years I got hearing aids. So I didn't have any hearing aids. So what to speak of Prabhupada's accent and my inability to hear, I was having a hard time understanding, plus the psychedelics residually floating around in my brain cells. So Prabhupada points at this coffee table and says, "Do you see this ant?" And I've been looking very carefully, and I know Srila Prabhupada is the external representative of Super Soul, that when Prabhupada says there's an ant, there's an ant. And I looked at the table, and there was no ant there. And I said, "Do you see that ant?" And I didn't know what he meant. I said, "There's no ant." And I said, sort of like yes and no combined, because I didn't want to say no and appear stupid to not see the spiritual or whatever ant was there. And I didn't want to say yes and be proven a liar because I couldn't see the ant and I didn't know where it would be found. So then Srila Prabhupada looked at me intensely as though that the ant issue now being solved, he wanted to get on to real business, and he said, "My duty," he said, "is to, my job," he said, "is to understand what is my duty to this ant." I said, "Oh no." I said, "Not only there's an ant that I can't see, but now I have a duty to it." I said, "What am I going to do?" He said, "Somehow," Prabhupada looked at me beseechingly almost, "somehow I have to help this ant." He said, "And maybe I can chant," and he said, reaches down, he says, "Maybe I can chant Hare Krishna." Or he went like this, "Feed it a little prasadam." He said, if we can help one ant become Krishna conscious, then our whole movement is a glorious success. And then I realized it was a pure metaphor. That Prabhupada was aware of my bewilderment is pretty obvious. That he used it to make a point was excellent. And there I was, instructed by the invisible ant to whom I had a duty to feed and to chant, and that if I did so, it was our movement, whole movement was a success.
My parents came to see me at the manor, and Prabhupada was in London, and I'd come back from London to the manor to meet with my parents. I hadn't seen them for about 5 years, and they had never seen me as a devotee. So during the course of the afternoon, I went to look for some prasadam for them, and there was none. I was told, well, we have an early Sunday feast here and there's nothing left. So I was unable to give them any. Anyway, I took them around the manor and I explained a bit of the philosophy, etc. They were unfortunate in that they didn't get to see Srila Prabhupada. They were just about to leave because they had a 4-hour drive home when Prabhupada came back from London, and he came in through the gate just as we were stood there and they were, you know, saying goodbye. So they kind of got a glimpse, that was all. Anyway, so afterwards, after they'd gone, I went up to see Srila Prabhupada and he asked me, well, how did it go with your parents? So I said it was very nice, they were very favourable, and, you know, I showed them the deities and we looked around and, you know, I explained a bit of the philosophy. So then Prabhupada said, did they get prasadam? So they said, oh, well, actually I was told there wasn't any. And Prabhupada said, oh. It was almost like, well, what was the use? You know, if they didn't get prasadam, then the whole trip was basically a failure. So, you know, he put a lot of emphasis on prasadam. It was a very practical way, you know, for a person to make advancement in Krishna consciousness.
One big businessman, he came and he was saying, Swamiji, I have this factory here in Delhi and I have that factory in Zonpur, and he gave a list of his things, and then he said, I have all this but I can't sleep. So Prabhupada looks at him and he says, that is why you can't sleep. You give all this to me, then you can peacefully sleep. So then he turns to somebody who was sitting there and he said, I think it was Gopal Krishnaji. He said, take his address. So this man says, no, Swamiji, I can come anytime. You can come anytime, but we should also be able to come anytime. Take his address. And then he was ready, you know. So yes, and said, no, Swamiji. Prabhupada said, no, take his address. We will relieve you of your problem. You give some of these things to Krishna, then you will be peaceful. And he was like smashed right there. And he did give his address. He had to.
There was a gentleman who came to see him in Geneva at the tail end of a series of other guests. The other guests had been distinguished VIPs from the United Nations and other organizations. And this man was a very simple, humble person who was had come to the temple a couple of times. And so after all of these kind of high-level conversations, this man comes in and Prabhupada looks at him and says, so, do you have any questions? And the man says, in French, and we translated, said, no, I heard that you were coming. And I was just so happy to think that I would get to meet you. And so thank you for receiving me. Prabhupada looked at him for a moment like this. And then he said, Yogeshwar, bring my harmonium. Hansaduta, you play kartal. And he started singing, chanting Hare Krishna, Hare. And he went on having a small little kirtan there in the room for about 10 minutes, after which the man offered his pranams and thanked Srila Prabhupada and stood up and left. And Prabhupada looked at us with this beautiful smile and said, he was a simple soul, so I knew that he would appreciate. This is the most lovely reciprocation I think I'd ever seen. You know, that he sang for this man because he was a sincere soul.
And my father also asked at that time, he said, why are you so anxious to give everyone your food, even if they don't know anything about your philosophy? And Prabhupada said, do you believe in infection? And my father said, yes. And Prabhupada said, just like if you eat the food of a sick person, you'll be infected with their disease. And in the same way, if you eat the food that Krishna's eaten, you'll be infected with Krishna's disease. So that was really wonderful. And when we walked out of the room, my father looked at me. He said, now I understand why you've joined this movement. This is a genuine holy man. So that was very nice.
During the Nectar of Devotion series in Vrindavan in 1972, when Prabhupada gave the Nectar of Devotion series for 1 month, there was one doubt that was plaguing me because we were putting so much effort into book distribution. But I'd always been taught when I was first joining that the parampara is like a link, a chain. And if you don't have the perfect link, if you're not initiated, you really can't go back to Godhead. And so I had this doubt that we're distributing so many books, but these people will read them, but if they're not initiated, they can't go back to Godhead. So I followed Prabhupada from back Rupa Goswami's Samadhi back into the courtyard. And just before Prabhupada took the steps up onto his courtyard, I presented this question to Prabhupada. I said, we're distributing so many books, but if people aren't initiated, then they can't go back to Godhead. And Prabhupada turned and looked at me right in the eyes, and he said, just by reading my books, they're initiated. And I thought that, another example of compassion, because I thought that was just an incredible example of compassion.
And I remember I asked Nitai, he was a Prabhupada servant at the time, Nitai Prabhu, and then I asked him, did Prabhupada ever say where he's going to be preaching in the next life? And Nitai told me, well, I never heard that question. I could go and ask him right now. So he went right into Prabhupada's room and came out. Prabhupada said, I'm going to preach in the lower planets in the next life. And I was like, completely fazed. So much compassion. This is what struck me most with Prabhupada was his compassion. It's like bottomless. He was like willing to do anything to please Mahaprabhu and to please his spiritual master. But when he said, I'm going to preach to the lower planets, I was thinking, how can someone do that? That was really, really, striking.